Hello, class. So now we're getting into chapter two, and I want to just touch on a couple points in this chapter. Really what we're focusing on here is defining the marketing research problem and developing an approach. This is really important in the upfront before doing any research. So at the beginning of your book here in this chapter, they talk a little bit about the story that the author's been through. So in these slides, we'll go through this. I mean, it's not my personal story, but this is a story that the author's recounting. But let's talk a little bit about it. He talks about a restaurant chain study where one particular day he had an alumni of the school come to him who worked for, I guess, a market research company or something to that effect. And he was asking for help analyzing some data. So when the author of the book talked to this individual, he got the questionnaire and he got the data. And the question was from this alumni, hey, can you help me analyze this data? So the first question that the author of the book asked was, what is the problem or question that we're trying to address? Which is really key. Now, see, why this is important is actually because when you talk about data analysis, it's not an independent exercise, meaning that we don't just jump into data and start analyzing just for the sake of analyzing. Because actually, if you go in that way, you could be analyzing data for years. I mean, you can keep cutting it in all different directions, looking at subgroups, running different analysis on it, all these kinds of things. When we analyze data, we're trying to go in with a hypothesis. We're trying to go in and understand, what's happening in the data to answer a specific question. Okay, and that's where this comes in. So again, the goal is really to provide information related to the research problem components. I mean, that's kind of a lengthy way to say we're trying to go into the data to understand a particular question. That is an objective of the research. Okay, so this author then goes on to say that he was surprised to learn that actually a market research problem was never defined for this work. And so they actually had to take a step back and define the issue. Now, what's funny is actually this happens more often than you would think, okay? So it is actually quite common, I would say in the business world and real world application, to be doing work. And not that there's no research problem that's identified, but a lot of times it's very hazy or ambiguous or very, very general, okay? And so without those objectives well defined, it gets a bit difficult to understand why it is we're really doing the work and the best way to then go do that work. I want to take a minute to just talk a little bit about the problem definition process that's laid out in the text, okay? So you'll see this in your book. But it's a very detailed approach to how we go about, landing on a research design, how we're approaching the problem. And this will allow you to find and articulate what your research problem is. Now, one quick note on that actual term research problem, not a huge fan of that language because it's not always a problem that we're trying to solve. But think about it more in terms of like, what are the objectives of the research? What are the key questions this research is meant to answer, okay? Now, again, this layout is very detailed. And in practice, in real life, when you're working for a brand or a market research company, a lot of this information will be somewhat inherent, okay? Because you're living and breathing the brand, you're working with the brand, so a lot of this stuff you might know already. That's both a positive and a negative because on one hand, it's good you have this information. The flip side to that, though, is that you might jump into certain solutions or assume certain problems before we actually really have a good handle on them. And so sometimes it makes sense to take a step back and be more thorough in like some of the tasks involved in the upfront, okay? So let's walk through it one step at a time. When we talk about the tasks involved, this is a lot of the precursor work that you would do before we even get into, figuring out what kind of methodology and what kind of research we want to do. That stuff comes later, kind of down the downstream process. Up front, what we really want to do is just figure out, what is the need for this work, okay? And the key part of these four things here is really the discussion with decision makers. You really need to talk to your stakeholders in the upfront and understand what kind of work needs to be done, okay? What are the key questions that they have as a business? And then how can we, as a research function, help answer those questions? Along with that, you might have to do interviews with experts. Things like, talking to your R&D team, for example. If it's about new product development, sitting down with the R&D team and working with them on, what are some of the issues that they're having if they're doing prototyping right now? How do we evaluate the prototypes? And what kind of material and information can we provide to consumers about those prototypes, okay? You have things like secondary data analysis. You might have to review market trends or category trends. And the last bit is qualitative research. So maybe, before we even understand what is the right questions to be asking, we might have to go off and do some work interviewing consumers, spending some time with them to understand what are the right questions to even ask. Okay. So this is some of the most preliminary work you can do up here in the tasks involved. But the thing I think is really the most crucial is the discussion with your stakeholders, those decision makers. Okay, understand what are the key issues they're facing. Any kind of research that we're going to devise, including the research problem, we want to then bring back to them and basically get their sign off or blessing. Okay, so that they're fully informed as we go through the research process. The other three are somewhat up in the air. That's kind of as needed, whether you need to do interviews with experts, secondary data analysis, etc. But again, these are some of the things that if you're working for a brand might be baked in already because you're living and breathing the brand. You'll be having product reviews or business reviews on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis, so you'll understand some of that secondary data analysis. You'll likely be reviewing competitive information on some kind of regular basis. So a lot of this stuff might be inherent to your working knowledge as you're working for a brand. But at times, there might be additional digging, okay? So as we go on from that, we want to look at the environmental context of the problem, okay? And again, a lot of these things you might have an understanding of working in an organization, but it's always good to kind of go back and make sure you're cognizant of these things. So is there previous information or forecasts that we need to understand before taking on some of these bigger questions? Do we understand the resources and constraints of the brand, of the organization? So some of the questions that the stakeholders might be asking that we have answers to, they might be $200,000, $300,000 types of projects, if we went full force. So we might have to think about that and devise different plans of attack depending on what the resources and constraints are. Also the priorities of the business and the stakeholders. What are the objectives? So not necessarily the objectives of the research, but what are the objectives of the organization on a larger scale? So what are the corporate objectives, for the year, like a 5-year plan? What are the personal objectives of your stakeholders? So for your CMO, is it important that they need to prove themselves, let's say, or have a successful campaign or, whatever that is? You need to be thinking about the objectives of the organization overall, but also the objectives of the individual stakeholders, okay? Different buyer behaviors to be aware of, the legal environment, the economic environment, your marketing and technological skills. Okay, these are all different things to be thinking about the environmental context before doing the research. Now, again, a lot of these things will be a bit inherent, but it never hurts to go back and take a look at this. Okay, so I want to make a distinction here between the management decision problem and the market research problem or objective. Again, I prefer the terms objectives more so than problems because problem has a negative connotation. And again, it's not always a problem that we're trying to solve. But the key distinction here that's important is understanding from your stakeholders, from let's say your CMO or the VP of the brand or whoever it might be. What is the key question that they have that's going to help them drive the business if they have the answer? And then how do we turn that into an objective of the research? So some good examples here. You'll see things like, or you hear questions from your stakeholders, your CMO about, should we introduce a new product? Should we launch a new product into the marketplace? Okay, that would translate to a market research objective, something like to determine consumer preference and purchase intent for the proposed new product. Okay. Should the advertising campaign be changed? Should we change the creative, for example, in this advertising campaign? On the objective side, we would say something like to determine the effectiveness of a current advertising campaign. Okay, so you see on the objective side, these are larger, overarching kind of objectives, and we're actually going to dial that down and get a little more granular. So here's where we talk a little bit about bringing those down a little bit, those larger objectives. That's kind of the broad statement that you see here. So for example, we take the one about determining customer preference and purchase intent for a new product, right? So let's say we're working in innovation and we're looking to launch a new product, but we have to understand if the new product we're going to launch, if people are going to like it, if they're going to be into it, are they willing to spend money on it? Well, there's a lot of different ways we can do that. There's a lot of different aspects that we have to check to make sure that this new product launch is going to make sense. So for example, if we bring that down to specific components, it might be things like, well, let's evaluate the appearance and design of the new product. We need to evaluate the different options or flavors or components of what this product is. We also need to evaluate the user experience. Okay, so the usability of this thing. I mean, again, imagine we're talking about launching a new cell phone, let's say, right? And it has all these new features that nobody's ever seen before. Well, we're going to need to evaluate and understand the user experience of the appearance, of the design, of the different options of the phone, the usability, how simple or difficult it is to use the device. So, it's going to be things like that. So we're taking this larger objective of understanding the preference and purchase intent for a new product and bringing it down into these different smaller components that we need to understand to say, yes, we think this product's going to be successful in the marketplace. Okay, so let's talk about the components of the approach. So now that we have those smaller pieces from the broad statement, we need to start thinking about how we're going to approach those pieces, okay? There's a number of different components here under the approach to the problem in step 2. One of the things we can look at is the objective or theoretical foundations, okay? So are there conceptual schemes or frameworks, principles that we know and understand that we can use to base our research around? Are there certain ways to go about this type of research or address this type of question that's been used in the past that's proven successful that we need to be thinking about? The other piece is the analytical model. So this is basically where we're trying to understand a relationship between variables that we're looking at. So for example, if we have a new product, we can say, maybe package type. We know package type has a big impact on purchase intent or likability, let's say. Or we know that the graphic on the label actually has a large driver of consideration of the product, right? So the key thing is we can put these variables together and understand how one might affect another. And there's a few different ways we can do that. Verbal, where you're basically speaking those out and understanding the relationships, kind of a cause and effect to the best that we know, relationship. You can have a graphical, where it's like a schematic almost, that's showing relationships between different variables, the intersections, what influences another. And lastly, mathematical, if we're so lucky, to be able to understand how, you put these different components in at different levels, you get a certain output, okay? The research questions, these are the refined statements of the specific components of the problem. So like we talked about before, if we're talking about, hey, we need to evaluate the package design, okay? Well, we might have to take that down to actually create a specific research question. So for example, of the 3 pack types that we're testing, which pack type has the largest desirability, drives the most consideration, and is the most clear and maybe on brand, for our consumers, for example. So we know from that particular question, we're testing a number of key variables around the pack type. Okay, things like clarity or on brand and all that kinds of brand relevance, if you will. The second to last part is the hypothesis, where we might have a number of these hypotheses, which basically we take the research question and we're saying, what do we think the outcomes are going to be? Okay, so for example, we might have a hypothesis of, folks who are current brand users might find a particular label to be more compelling because maybe, we're using an old logo, let's say, or something like that. So we might have different thoughts or different expectations about how the research will play out, and that's where our hypotheses come in, all right? The last part, there might be a specification of the information needed, all right? So we might have to call out, hey, this particular information that we need to understand to address these research problems, do we have all that information, okay? Is there certain information that we need to go get to make this worthwhile and to understand the outcomes? So once we've gone through all 5 of these pieces in the approach to the problem and define this information, this allows us to then get to the actual research design, okay? And so through this process, we should be very clear at this point about why we're actually doing this work, okay? And what is the research problem or research objectives that we are trying to address, okay? So that way when you go to a data analysis or even creating the research plan, designing the research, it's very clear how we need to design this research based on all the parameters that we came through and the key objectives that we're trying to hit. Okay, and then again, for the data analysis, when you get into the data, you understand what data you're trying to crunch, how you're trying to understand it, what groups you might need to look at, what kind of analyses you need to run because of the research objectives that you've set at this stage, right? So again, just a quick little overview to understand why this part is so important of the research process. If you don't have this understanding about what your research objectives are and why you have those objectives, and also to make sure they're aligned with your stakeholders, this can be extremely problematic because what'll happen is you'll get down the road, lots of money spent. I mean, I'm talking like hundreds of thousands of dollars spent, $200,000, $300,000 study, to have stakeholders, other people in the organization say, well, wait, why did we do this work? It wasn't worth it. We didn't get the results that we needed. This really doesn't help the business. And then you're in a really tough place, okay? So again, it makes a lot of sense to do this work up front and also check in with the stakeholders and make sure they're on the same page and they're aligned to the research objectives, some of the approach that you're doing, different things that you want to do throughout the research, and bring them along for the ride so that they're very clear about why we're doing what we're doing and the outputs that come through. Doing that will make you quite successful, all right? All right, thanks again, guys. That's it for this lecture, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.